My name is Ron Parish. My parents came out here from Arkansas back in the late 40s and lived here in Farmersville, small little house hut. And eventually we moved to Giant Oak Ranch, which is just east of town a little ways. And I went to school here in Hester, Snowden, and then Exeter High, because there was no Aztecs back then. And worked and knew everybody here pretty well, and was involved with the volunteer fire department from a very young age. And it was like having 30 dads. They were ancient. They were really old because they were like 30 years old, and I was like 15, so it made them seem very old.
Action.
My name is Joe Singh. I'm 79 years old. I was born in 1946. I have lived my whole life pretty much just on the family ranch south of Farmersville here. I went to Outside Creek School, and then my dad moved into town in the 7th grade, and I went to Mineral King School in Visalia, and then Redwood High School. After I was drafted into the Army in 1966, I spent 3 years during the Vietnam era in the Army. While I was in the service, I met my wife, who was from Farmersville here. And so when I got out of the service, we moved back to Farmersville, lived here in Farmersville until I bought the family ranch from them. And we've lived out there. All our kids were raised out there. Okay, some of my early memories of Farmersville was since coming into Farmersville, that was a big thing for us. And we would save our money up, and we would come into a little store here in Farmersville. It's where the Fast Trip store is, Fast Trip gas station is now. And there was a store called, it was Mr. Dearmore. It was a 5 and dime store there. And they had everything a young kid would want. You know, you could go in there with a nickel and spend all morning long trying to find some little something in his store. Across from that was a place that Ron and I talked about here the other day. It was, what was the name of the saloon there, Ron? The
Frontier Club.
The Frontier Club. It was an old brick building set right on the corner there. It's where the Jolly Cone is right now. There was pretty much the other corners had gas stations on them. That's where pretty much the whole town would feature around, was where you'd go to get gas. Nichols Payless Market is where what's the name of that store now? Anyway, it was the main grocery store in town. There was 2 stores at that time. There was Nichols Payless and Cham's Supermarket. And Nichols Payless, they used to have big weekend programs there where they bring in like country and western stars, and everybody would go to town on the weekends to shop there. Farmersville was made up pretty much of a lot of people who came out here from Oklahoma and Arkansas. It was a farming community. Most of them worked in the in the farms around this area. Excuse me. Maybe Ron could add to that some.
Well, that's basically what my parents did too. My mom was a nurse's aide at first, and for Exeter Hospital, because it was one of the main hospitals here back in those days. It was a big hospital, a lot of doctors, and Exeter. And my dad ended up working at Giant Oak Ranch and as an irrigator. And then we lived at a place called Mr. Walls' place. It's just on the edge of town here. And Billy Walls had a walnut orchard, and he and Orland Tucker grew hay. And so he ran the Boy Scouts. Not the Cub Scouts, but the Boy Scouts. And so when they had their big meetings, I was a little kid, I'd go out there and listen to them, and they'd pass out stuff. And he continued that, and all of the kids in that neighborhood were all poor. And he'd load up his pickup with everybody and take them down on Ash, and the boulevard was what we knew as the Frosty stand, and buy everybody an ice cream cone every afternoon at 3:30. But if you went home with him for lunch, he had a breezeway and you had to keep your mouth shut and take a nap. And so everybody took a nap when you went there. And he knew they were such a good family. His daughter was named Jewel, and she ended up over the senior program here in Farmersville forever. And she lived there until she passed away in her home. But it's when you look back at the businesses or locations and how they've changed hands, and they're a different business today. So somebody might have known it as like we did, like Chan's, and then it turned out to be something else, and the Nichols Payless turned to be something else. And depending on how old you are, you can reach way back and see some of that stuff. And the Lions Club was very active here in Farmersville back in the day, and the volunteer fire department was very active. And they did a lot of donations to the schools. If you had a wrestling team and they needed money, they needed to go here, there. Between the Lions Club and the fire department, we donated. And we had fundraisers, and we brought in a carnival, made money on that. We had a handicap day, and I'll refer back to fire a lot for the fact that when I was very young, I went to work for the Quallses and the Featherstons, and they and Daryl was a volunteer, and so he would say, "Come with me," and we'd go burn a lot. They give us $100 to burn the lot back in the day when you could burn, and that's one of our fundraisers. And so when you look back at it, you look at a lot of the businesses, they changed hands. We talked about barbershops. You know, there was Robert's Barbershop was right on next to Dearmore's, and then Rudy McGinnis came there years later, and Martin Van Ness and Clifford ended up down by the railroad tracks, down in the hole where the church is. And it was down there for a long time, and then they built a place across the street, and they weren't partners anymore. So Clifford went and put one in right across the street from the post office. And later on, after Clifford, he became a pilot, started crop dusting. Then my friend Joe Sink put a bait shop in there. So as time goes, you'll see a lot of these businesses that changes hands and they change the facial structure. But Farmersville was very small back then, but Exeter was even smaller. Exeter was really small, but very wealthy in Exeter compared to Farmersville, because they had all the people that come from Arkansas, Oklahoma, and they're poor. That's why they were at Linnell Camp, and as they got progressed and get into the construction and all the trades, they moved out of there, okay? And same here in Farmersville, that's the same with my parents. And so when you look at it, it's been a very big experience. My parents were divorced when I was like 13, and the people I was working for then happened to be the Quallses, and they took and kind of put me under their thumb, and Daryl got me in the volunteers, and I just go down there for a while. I wasn't officially a volunteer, but I'd go there, and all these guys were in there, like 25 or 30 guys. And so they'd see me around town hanging with the wrong person. They're like, "Hey, it's okay to have him as a friend, but don't hang with him." And so it's like having 30 fathers. So it was really, I give them credit for how I grew up, because I could have gone a lot of different paths, okay? But the volunteer fire department was there with 30 guys that were community people that directed me different ways. And just like Joe and I, our paths cross a lot, and his father-in-law was a Sunday school teacher, and so you look at some of these places, and you look at back then there wasn't as many Mexican people back in that day. But it has reverted a lot. There's probably about 70% maybe back in that day of Caucasian, and maybe 20 or 30% Mexican people, and different nationalities, but Mexican people, there was not that many. And now it appears there's more, that has kind of flipped a little bit. And for me, and I lived in Visalia only for after I was married, I lived in Visalia for like a year, bought a house down by the Royce Park, lived there for 16 years, I think it was, or 18 years, and was involved with the fire department, involved with the Lions Club some, and
At that time, if you were anybody in Farmersville, you belonged to a couple of organizations.
Yes.
It was either the fire department or the Lions Club.
Yes.
And so most of the people that had any, you might say, political pull, if they was on the school board, if they were on the city council, they belonged to one of them organizations. And them two organizations work together, as far as supporting the community, fundraising and things like that. So, anyway, I just wanted to
I agree.
where Ron was going. That's kind of how I got involved with Ron and some of the other people here in town. A lot of the school teachers that now came out of them departments. One that I can think of offhand, Jerry Clark, was our engineer at the fire station when we were young volunteers. I think his daughter ended up being
Mindy.
She worked at the school at what capacity?
She was a principal for a while. She was a teacher and then a principal and then back to a teacher, as far as I know.
Right, at your local high school here. But that's how Farmersville was. It really leaned heavily on the civic, the communities. I can think of things like the school board. I know my wife was on the school board here, and at the same time, I ran for the school board for Exeter High School. I didn't get voted in, but she served several years here on the school board, and people was very involved with it. If you knew anybody at all here in town, you knew that they were all intertwined. My sister, she moved into Farmersville here, and she was on the planning commission. Her husband, Rob, he ended up becoming a volunteer also. A lot of the teachers, I can think of like Steve Rye, who was a teacher here, was involved in the volunteer fire department. It was, as a group of volunteers, you had a lot of political pull also. So when the city needed something, they would come to us and say, hey, we need your support on this, because most of them people there, they knew who our board of supervisors. For example, one of our board of supervisors that represents this area right now used to be a policeman here in Farmersville. And he interacted with the volunteer fire department, and that's how Ron and I know him now. So we go, a lot of them things, relationships went way back because it was involvement in the community. And that's how I know you. So, okay, I was asked about the flood in 1955, I think it was. That was a flood what they call a 100-year flood. There's cycles when things happen. But on that particular time, that flood come through here, it flooded pretty much most of Farmersville. We live south of town, and actually one of the creek that runs through here, right next to Snowden School, runs out behind the back of our ranch. I can remember that night as the waters came, we slept in the attic. And I remember looking out of the hole from the attic down at my uncle, who slept on a chair downstairs. And I can remember he was just sitting on a chair with water all around him, about 6 foot deep in the house, the old ranch house there. And the next morning, my dad and I loaded up, and he liked to take videos, you know, the old 8 millimeter films, and we drove out around Visalia. Um, and he was taking videos, of which I have a lot of them flood pictures. And the days that passed, we drove up to Three Rivers, and we saw where the water coming through there had taken out the bridges there in Three Rivers. I can remember there was a little cable that ran across the river with just a little bucket in it that people could get across the river, and they would pull themselves across the river because it was years before that bridge was rebuilt. Um, I have videos of the water coming into Mineral King School. My aunt lived right outside the gate of Mineral King School, and I remember seeing that water just coming up the street. And my mom was rushing us to get in the car and get out of there. Um, the the next day we drove into Farmersville here, and just up where you see, it'd be just past where the mini storage is there. It was the Terry property. That low area there became a river. It was flowing water across the road and eating out. So that cut off that access there. Most of the water around Farmersville, it was anywhere from a foot to 2 foot deep. It did quite a bit of damage because most of these old homes in Farmersville were built back in the 30s and 40s, and so it was a lot of everybody's belonging. If they couldn't get them up, it was flooded. Took a long time to recover, and that was before they built a dam up here that we know it now to control them type of floods. Ron, what do you remember about that?
Thing I remember about it, I was going to school at Hester School, and I was in elementary school, and we were going home, and it was the day or two before the flood, actually. And the ditch that's going through town, that goes by Joe's house and by my house now out of town, it was running full, just churning. And it looked like it was going over the bank any time. And I remember looking over the side of the bridge as I walked across that bridge right before you get to, I can't remember the name of the street now. But anyway, right as you go across the bridge there, and it was scary. As a little kid, it was really scary. But back then, nobody come and picked you up. You just walk home. And so we walked home. I was living at Giant Oak Ranch then, walked home. And then the next morning, our home sat about this high off the ground. And I got up, and my parents were sleeping. It was Christmas. My parents were sleeping in, and I go in there and I go, "Dad, there's water outside." He's like, yeah. Because every year the ditch would swell a little bit there, and we had a low area, then it came up. And there was a pecan orchard. You get water in there sometimes, and then it'd come up. Well, it was already going around our house. And he got up, and he used a term, I won't use it, but like, "Shucks, you didn't tell me there's water all around the house." And we got up, we had a cow and a pig and all this stuff. We had to move them to higher ground. And then at the time, John Oak Ranch had 18 employees, full-time. And so they had all their people out there, and they were taking these big poles, and the stuff would come down the creek or down the ditch. They would take and push down on it and shove it to go under to keep from washing the bridge out. And once you got over to Anderson Road, it was dry. As you go toward Exeter, it starts getting dry. It's higher. So the flood was really from about Cornucopia back this way, because this is a low area. And and I was a little kid, and this guy's granddaughter was wanting to go to some school function at Exeter High School, and they put her on a bobtail truck, and she was dressed in a nice formal dress, and drove her across that bridge, water going everywhere. And I was like, I thought they were going to wash away. And then, but she went to her school function extra, it was all dry. But when you look at it here, this town, Lankford's, it was a gas station right on the corner across from, catty corner from Fast Trip. And he had about 6 pumps, but it seemed like a lot of pumps back in those days because the highway was only 2 lane. and it's real narrow. And so when you went there, you were awed because there were so many pumps. And he had a car on a stand out there, a little higher than this right here, probably. And he gave it away as a promotion to get people to come and buy gas, get tickets. And I can remember the floodwater going all around that, you know. And it's kind of amazing how far that water went. Visalia, the Mill Creek plugged up and it blew out, come down the alleyway and flooded downtown Visalia. And we've all seen, there's pictures of that too. And but it was pretty dramatic back then. We were just blessed not to, because there's people who went different places trying to get to high ground. Because like Joe said, a lot of homes were really flooded. And Cameron Creek, my wife's relatives, they went up in the attic. And somebody went down and got them out of the attic eventually, because that's really low in there. And I know there was an outbuilding where Joe was speaking right there where Cameron Creek Church is right there. And then Marion Phillips had a contracting, labor contracting for picking grapes and all that stuff. And it was low. There's horses in there now in Woodyard, and it washed out the highway.
It was like a river running through.
Yeah, it was like a river running through it. And it had a house, and it really was just a small house, but it was probably a small outbuilding, but it was big to me. You see that wash across the road, down where the gas companies and the concrete plants are now? It was just floating down through there. And for me, that was really big. But, you know, we all recovered from it. Everybody helped everybody. And then you had to, everybody really looked forward to getting the shots because everybody's afraid of getting, and they had to come in to give everybody shots. And
Ron, before we get in this, I wanted to talk about how Farmersville, you know, was an unincorporated city.
Yeah.
When we grew up. And finally, they decided to incorporate. And a lot of the people that we knew, my father-in-law, Truman Qualls, he was one of the first, the council
city
members.
councilman. Willis Freeman.
Willis Freeman, Jim Torno, he was our first mayor.
Yep.
We all stay in contact. Jim Torno's daughter, who's my wife's best friend, and we still stay in contact with her. She lives in Texas now. But all these people were together. I mean, knew each other pretty well. Right now, if you go over here to Sam's Market, there's a big, I think the Clampers put a stone thing up there commemorating the first council members. You'll see that out there and list all the first council members of the city. And there was a big involvement here in Farmersville with the local people. Everybody stayed pretty much contacted. My wife was one of the Farmersville Queens. You know, the Lions Club used to sponsor the Queen, and a lot of the very first one was Floridine Nichols, who was the first Farmersville Queen. She still lives here in Farmersville. You know, over the years, there's been a lot of them because that was a big thing. The Memorial Day Parade for Farmersville, ever since I can remember, was a big thing. Everybody would come to town, and of course you'd have Ron and I being volunteer firemen. We'd get our engines up, and later on I went to work for CDF at that time, Cal Fire now. And I know at one point I was a captain for the city of Exeter, and we'd bring the engines over, and you know, you had your police department. One of some of our old police chiefs, Gary Meeks, was very well known at that time here in Farmersville. And Gary was also he was chief of police, but he also was kind of overhead of the fire department as far as the city level goes. And each of us in the volunteer part where we served, I know Ron was volunteer fire chief for a period of time. I was. My brother-in-law Rob Brenner was a volunteer chief.
Your brother-in-law Daryl?
My brother-in-law. Both my brother-in-law. Lonnie Qualls had the local auto parts store here in town. He later ended up having stores in Exeter and Wood Lake. they all come. It all came from my father-in-law, who was a mechanic here in Farmersville, where the what is the get and go down there by
Across from Chance?
across from the old Chan's Market. That was at one time I owned that property. My father-in-law had a garage there. I bought it off of him, and then I sold it to Pete Giada, who had all the get and goes, and he put it was a Farmersville get and go in there at the time. A lot of the I think there was a get and go in Exeter also right there. There was just a lot of involvement, with local people here.
See, I worked with his father-in-law, and it wasn't his father-in-law at the time, but I worked for his father-in-law. And at the time, that gas station here, I pumped gas and chased parts, okay? And that was when they actually used to go out and pump their gas, wash your windshield, check the air of your tires, all that stuff. And I was just a student. And where the Get and Go is now, that was an old building there. It was an old deserted furniture store. And a guy named Santos come in and put the back part of it as a mechanic shop. And he worked right off, it was dirt. And he worked off of dirt in there for a long time. And then eventually that turned into Johnny's Get and Go. And that whole lot, and then where the gas station was, it's just this side of there, that's still vacant. But you look at when I was little, the big thing was the Four Corners. That was really the whole thing here. And the next big thing was the Frosty stand at Ash and the Boulevard. And that's where everybody kids kind of hung out there. And because the town was really small. And when you look at, as it started, and then there's Hamlet's, right across from Nichols Place, used to be a little gas station. And they took the pumps out, but they did repairs. And they had served food and all, sold stuff. And to give you an idea of flathead Fords, you kids don't know what that is, but this flathead Ford is just a motor that was built several times. Go ahead, Joe.
Ron, before we end this, I want to talk about two things here in Farmersville that I think is pretty important. And that's the churches of Farmersville.
Yeah.
Is one I think we need to get into a little bit. There is a lot of different churches here in Farmersville. From the Pentecostals, the Catholic Church. I remember the Catholic Church has been pretty much located right where it's at now. I guess they're building a new church out there that is quite large. But everybody in Farmersville pretty much went to church somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It was either you went to church, or the other thing I want to talk to you about is the bars.
Church and bars.
Farmersville were known for their churches and their bars. Their churches, there was a lot of, pretty much every church was represented here in Farmersville. And if you didn't go to church, you went to one of the bars. And there was kind of like the old Frontier Club right here on the Four Corners. And there was what they call the Topper Club. And one of them, and one of the people you'll be talking to today was one of Don Mason, who owns Mason Tire. He also worked with Ron and my father-in-law for the local garage down there. He ended up being one of the main drivers here in Farmersville. He sat on the school board for many years. But he also owned the place, what was it, the Dewdrop Inn?
Dewdrop Inn.
There's an old bar out there where Claude's Buggies is now, right about there. And there was several bars here in town. It's funny because a lot of the people that ran them bars at that time, you would think you would never believe that they grow up to be a lot of the members of the community who really had a big impact on it. Like I say, Don Mason is still involved in the community. I think you know him from some of the civic clubs here. you, who's the one that fell off the ladder and died?
Oh, E.W. Bonds.
E.W. Bond, who worked at Nichols Payless. You know, at one time he he owned a bar here in town, but he ended up being
The
a
Long
very
Branch.
well-known person here in Farmersville. Worked at for Nichols Payless, and then ended up managing one of Leonard Whitney's Food for Less.
Yep.
He had all the Food for Less stores. He ended up being a member running that. So a lot of these people that were either involved in the bars or the churches end up coming back to their churches and being very involved in our local history, you might say, when you look back at some of these people. Farmersville has always been a community that was founded by its name. You know, Farmersville, most of the people here had something to do with the farming. And it's funny because a lot of the people that was involved in, they became our business leaders. They a lot of them have been very successful. And I think some of the people that come out of Farmersville, I know for me out at Outside Creek School, Gary Hester, who now if you drive out of Farmersville and out in that area, that was all Hester property. His grandfather, Hester School was named after his grandfather. They all farmed out there south of Farmersville. Up until a couple of years ago, the Hesters owned all the land from basically where the city hall is, where we're at right now, south, almost a mile south of here. They had a big influence, and a lot of the people that come out lived in Farmersville work for some of these farmers. A guy I went to grade school with, you know, we had our ethnic groups, you know, then. There wasn't as a lot of them because I can remember Wayne Davis, who was Indian. You know, I was half Chinese. We had our little black family that lived in. I remember it was an old rail car that out south of. It was kind of east of Outside Creek School. We had all of our ethnic groups, but a lot of them grew up to be. I know Wayne Davis. He ended up being a full professor out of Berkeley. You know, if you look at some of the people, I ran into a guy. I asked him about some roofing this morning. You know, he was running around here. He became a very big roofing contractor. And one of Ron's relatives, distant relative, Bill Ward, he ended up being a roofing contractor here. We spoke about my brother-in-law, Darrell Featherston, who was involved in the Parks House. He ended up owning Featherston Realty. You'll still see that office just west of the Four Corners here. I know he took in a young man, Sergio, and trained him in the real estate business, and later sold the real estate business, and which now he is retired and very successful in the real estate business. So there's a lot of people that did very well coming out of Farmersville.
And before we end it, I want to say this. Farmersville has always been a sports town. Always. Baseball. They used to have the Farmersville Tigers here. Okay? And as a little kid, Sweeney donated the park to him down here off Ash Street. And you go down there on Sunday afternoon. It didn't cost you to watch the game. And there's people coming from all over. Everybody was poor. So they had teams would come in and play each other. And they were known as the Farmersville Tigers. And as they went, some of the high school kids would join the team. And they never recruited us, but they missed it. No, but it was amazing. Little League here has always been big, okay? And our friend Larry Miller, he was always involved with Little League, and he was in the late years. And Dillard Ferguson, I can name you a lot of them, but the biggest thing is baseball was big here. There was no soccer back in the day when I was in school, okay? My kids played soccer, and so now you have a big crossover. You used to fight over fields here. There wasn't enough fields to go around. Now you got baseball fields and soccer fields. And it's really nice to see the total crossover. And so I just wanted to add that we were very much involved in sports here. We were very involved in the Lions Club, like Joe said. We were involved in the fire department, and those were core places. And all those people helped support all the different activities here, because a lot of them went into business, and that's what they did. Your turn, Joe.
Well,
And could I ask one more question? I know you told me, Ron, about, I think you started with a volunteer fire department when you were 15. And I know you described like how you would know there was a fire, how you would get to the fire station. What we were doing, a lot of students might not know the Four Corners is Visalia Road and Farmersville Boulevard, where there's a stoplight today. And just,
Okay.
yeah.
When I went to work pumping gas, I got involved with Daryl Featherston, which was in the fire department, and I was working for him. And I was cheap labor. There was not enough people during the day. Everybody went to work. So if we had a call, he'd say, "Come on, Ron, go with me." So I'd go with him, and it was unofficial. Nobody had to do anything back in that day. And I just couldn't get on the truck. And so the way we used to get a call was they had a siren, okay? And it was down, you kids might actually heard it. Exeter still has theirs. It goes off at lunchtime. Farmersville had one down at the one on Front Street, and it would go off 2 times for out in the county. And they said, well, we need to go more. So they went 3 times in the county. But if you lived in the city, when it became a city, okay, because it wasn't a city for a long time, but if you in this residential area, it would go 10 times, because they made sure the volunteers come to the scene, because they didn't want anybody to sleep through it, because they needed all the manpower. So it was really kind of funny. We'd have to drive to the station. If you couldn't see the fire, you drive down to the fire station. They leave the doors open, and they write on the chalkboard the address where it was at. And then you go to the scene of the fire. And then eventually, as Joe and I seen it transition into a pager where they tone you out. And then we seen it turn into a pager, not just where they would tone you, you were like, because your pager would fuzz sometimes, you couldn't get the whole address. And then finally they got it where you could push a repeat button, and so it would repeat it. Otherwise you're calling dispatch, hey, what was that address? And they hated everybody calling dispatch all the time. Here you got 30 guys trying to call and find out what the address is, because they couldn't see the smoke. And but Exeter mutual aid at Farmersville all the time. Back in the day, there wasn't a fire station on Lovers Lane and Walnut. It was on Northeast 3rd. And so Northeast 3rd was a long push. So this station here would run all the way to 99 on calls. We had a big response area, and a lot of it was back, you were second, third in, okay? And same with Ivanhoe, that direction. And what the county did at the time, they'd rotate equipment in here. So we would have, you'd start out new on Northeast 3rd and Visalia, and some of the real nice stations, the bigger towns. And then as it became a little older, they would push it out to the little communities like Farmersville, Pixley.
Well, you got to talk about the volunteer engines here. There was 2 engines that when I became a volunteer down here, and so the paid personnel, and they worked a big long shift. They had like 5 days on and 2 days off. But the volunteers maintained an engine down there, and guys like Ron and I, when it would go off, we'd rush to the fire station to see who would get the volunteer engine to take it to the fire. And I know Ron and I, we were very competitive about who would get there to get the engine. There was times that he'd get there, and so I'd jump on the engine with him. There was other times that if you got there early enough, the engineer wanted you on the engine with him. I can remember going to a fire in Exeter and getting on the back of the engine. At that time, it was engine 10. The
Chevy.
volunteer engine was 210. And we left the fire station out there, and when we hit the Four Corners here, where the stoplight is, Jerry knew how to drive that engine. He shifted when we hit that intersection. I was on the tailgate of that engine with a guy named Larry Miller. We was going to a packing house fire in Exeter. And when he turned that corner, it was everything I could do to hang on the back of that engine. And we headed to Exeter. That was a big thrill to ride on the back of a fire engine. And I think there was some times we even had people on the sideboards. My first interaction with the fire department was Ron here had been a volunteer for years, and Gary Meeks, who was our chief of police, had been a volunteer. And they kept on after me to come down and become, the volunteers. And one night they had a barbecue down at the station. And so I went down there for that barbecue. That night, they had a big fire out here by Union School. Right across from Union School, there was a big old wooden barn. And so when that alarm went off, they put me in the engine there, and I rode out there with them. And my eyes got so big because that big old barn on fire. Well, Ron was running one of the engines there, and there was some of the other guys, and I ran around, and nobody would let me squirt any water because, no, you got to be a volunteer. And so the very next day, I filled out the papers to become a volunteer, and it ended up changing my life because at that time, I owned a supermarket, a grocery store in Tulare, and I owned a liquor store in Visalia. And it changed my whole life because I became a volunteer, ended up changing careers midlife, just because of that interaction right there. Once firefighting gets in your blood, that's all you want to do.
Well, I think too, if for the kids, if they happen to see this part of it, you can see how, as a young person, being involved with older people, and they weren't really that old, but 30 seemed ancient. And now I'm 80, it really seems ancient. So when you look at it, like Joe said, and now that they don't let you ride on the tailboard anymore, and because a lot of people are hurt in Los Angeles, they'd run into the tailboard and decapitate legs and stuff. And so eventually they got where you couldn't do that. But back in the early days, you could get on there and you had to hold on tight because these guys were driving. The trucks were like 52 Chevys or GMCs and that kind of thing. And they were running 65. But 60, 65 is fast when you're hanging on the back end of that truck and you're seeing things go by. And then when you didn't have anything that says, we're going to make a left turn, okay? So you're back there, you're holding, and all of a sudden they make a left turn at an intersection and you're like, and I was in a deal like that once, and as soon as we got on the straight road, I was little, I crawled up through the crack of that thing and I got up in the hose bed and I hang on with all four. And when we got there, I was like, phew. And I told the engineer, which happened to be Jerry Clark, I told him, you could have killed me. But back in the day, Frank Callahan was here in 1960 and Jim Cullum. Frank just passed away, and really neat because I went and seen a guy, Jim Cullum. He lives in Tucson now and he's still alive. So when you get 80 and you find these people that you really worshiped and were there to kind of give you a guide and try to teach you and encourage you to try to better yourself and go for the tests, take the test, do the homework. You can't say any more than that, And if I was trying to encourage the youth, that's exactly what I'd tell them. If you can belong to a club, you may feel really strange when you belong because everybody's old in there. And you go there and you're like, I don't want to be in with all these old people. And the only reason it kind of kept me was because I happened to be working for a guy that was involved in it. And so he's like, come on, go with me. And so I quit pumping gas and go to the fire. And the fire was a lot more fun than pumping gas and chasing parts. So when you look at stuff like that,
it's career changing.
It is.
Because Ron, ever since I've known him, he's been a fireman. And finally, when the city of Farmersville here broke away from the county, he ended up becoming a full-time fireman. Before that, most of his life was a barber. And for me, I went from being a groceryman to being out of that one little incident I just spoke to you about, becoming a fireman. I end up, working pretty much all the north part of the county. I worked a few years in Fresno County. Um, I have a lot of my volunteers that I worked with over the years. Right now, I just heard the other day, one of the division chiefs in Farmersville was one of my volunteers. That I remember the day he walked into the fire station and started, wanting to become a volunteer and training with, and now he is a division chief. One of the guys I worked with off of Exeter Ambulance, back in them days, we didn't have paramedics. And when we would go out to these medical aids with the fire department, the Exeter Ambulance, a lot of times they needed, if they were working a code or there was only 2 people on the ambulance. And so they would grab someone like Ron or I to ride in the back to help them with CPR. There was times that we even drove the ambulance with the 2 of them in the back there. It caused me to get involved in the medical side of it. I ended up taking an EMT class with my wife, and my wife worked for the state at the time. She ended up going back to school, became an RN, and she retired from Delta as an RN. I went on and I was in the second class of the EMT2s, which was our county's version of a paramedic. And I remember when I first got my EMT and come into Farmersville here, we'd go on medical aids, and a lot of the guys thought, well, I knew so much more than them. It was very rewarding. Some of the things, when you save someone's life with doing CPR. I've delivered 7 babies in the field. That can be very rewarding. I still remember some of the babies I delivered, and as they grew up over the years, I wish I could track some of them now. But the medical side, I can remember we started out with just a fire engine, and we'd carry oxygen bottles, and we really didn't know a whole lot. Basic first aid, we just knew the basic first aid. To now, we're running paramedics out here. I worked with some of them. When we first brought the first ambulance into Farmersville, it used to be located right where the city yard is, that little building there. And I helped convert that part of that building into our barracks. We slept there, and we ran the ambulance out of there. I was one of the first EMT2s here in this area. But I've seen the medical profession. It's funny because now when I went to Delta here a few months ago, on a medical issue, I fell down the stairs. And I thought I'd kill myself because I hit the hall tree at the bottom of it. Well, I went to the emergency room. When I worked there, when I did my medical time there at the emergency room, there was only 7 beds in the emergency room. Now you can get lost in that emergency room. There is so much more. But I can remember when I worked in there, as doing my clinical time at Delta and Tulare District, how small they were and how many people.
So you've seen a lot of changes over the years.
Big change
I really appreciate the 2 of you doing this together, and I think that, a lot of us, we take for granted, that we call 911 and someone's going to come right away and all that. It wasn't so easy back in the day. So thank you very much for everything. And I'm hoping we're going to be able to do some more of